Bom, pessoal, então agora a gente vai passar uma palestra que a gente gravou já. A gente gravou ela por conta do fuso horário, né? A palestrante é a doutora Eisa, ela está alocada na Itália. Então, por conta do fuso horário já está gravada. A gente vai passar para vocês e depois eu explico em relação às perguntas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be able to present our breeding program to you today. My name is Asia, and I'm a grape breeder at Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo. As you might know, Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo is the world's largest producer of wine plants. And from 2015, we have our breeding program, so I'm responsible for that breeding program. So let's start our presentation. And next slide, you can see the overview of what we are going to discuss today. First part of my presentation will be related to the Pcr breeding program itself. The second part will be related to the resistant varieties bred by University of Udine and Institute of Applied Genomics in collaboration with Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo VCR. That are available already on the market. And last but not least, we are going to discuss the protection strategy of these varieties. So next slide, please. Why resistant varieties? For sure, we have to talk about sustainability, which is very important nowadays. But when we are talking about resistant varieties, our first thought is to reduce the fungicide use in the vineyards. So in this case, we are talking about the reduction of costs and also organic viticulture and healthier final product, which is wine in this case, or table grapes. But last but not least, again, is the climate change. And in terms of resistant varieties, that means that we have to use varieties that are more adapted to this climatic change. So we are talking about, first of all, the technological maturity correlated to aromatic maturity of the grapes and their polyphenolic maturity. Simply speaking, we would like to have grapes that are more, which has higher acidity, lower pH, especially when we are talking about arid areas or thousand areas of viticulture. And the second aspect of climate change is the increase of pathogen aggressivity. This is really an issue nowadays because of the higher temperatures and also higher humidity in most of the countries. The pathogens are becoming more and more virulent, and we can see more and more diseases, new diseases in some areas. Next, I will talk about the situation with the resistant varieties in Italian market because we are coming from Italy. Nowadays, in our national catalog of varieties, we have 24 registered varieties. 14 varieties belong to the VCR breeding program, and 10 varieties belong to the German breeding programs. These varieties are quite different in their organoleptic properties, because of the different objectives of breeding activities. As you can see from the year of breeding of these varieties, for the German varieties, it was like 20 years earlier than when compared to the Italian varieties. So the breeding objectives for these varieties were quite different. For sure, they were of high resistance, but the quality aspect was not as crucial for the breeding programs of the past. Whereas in Italian breeding projects now, we are more focused not only on resistance, but also on the quality of final grapes. On the next slide, we will discuss a little bit about the classification. So why do we register these varieties? For sure, we register them for the wine growers, winemakers, and consumers who drink wine. So classification of these varieties is really, really important. As you can see, most of Italian varieties are already classified in wine lists in Italy in different regions. In this case, you can produce not only the table wines of the lower category, let's say, but also so-called EGTs, which are of higher quality wines, which is good for these varieties and for consumers in the end. On the next slide, you can see the average area of these resistant varieties in Italy. For sure, when compared with the total area of wines grown in Italy, it is rather slow, but the market is growing, especially with the growing request or demand for the organic products. So in general, Mediterranean countries like Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal are rather slow in adopting some new approaches in viticulture. So they are more conservative markets. That is why it is rather hard to push these varieties on these markets. Whereas if you are talking about the Central Europe or Northern Europe or countries outside Europe, they are more open-minded for sure, and it's easier to establish these varieties over there. And the request for these varieties is much, much higher. On the next slide, we can see the average acreage of these varieties in different countries. Oh, I can see now that the slide doesn't correspond with which I was talking. I'm sorry. Yes, the classification I've already talked about. So the next slide about the average acreage in Italy I've already talked about. And the next slide now I'm talking about. Yes, as we can see, the percentage of these resistant varieties grown in Europe is rather low when compared to the countries of outside Europe, which we consider is rather bad for European viticulture. But the situation is drastically changed in recent years due to the climate change and the demand for organic viticulture. And next slide. Now we are going to talk about the Pcr Breeding Program. Next slide, please. In 1998, the University of Udine starts a breeding program aimed to obtain new grape varieties resistant to downy and powdery mildew with high enological properties. These varieties we are going to discuss a little bit later. They contain a predominant proportion of Vitis vinifera genome in them. Most of the varieties contain more than 90% of Vitis vinifera genome, and which is rather good for their quality in the end. In 2006, Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo started a very tight collaboration with Institute of Applied Genomics and University of Udine in introduction of these varieties to the market. So in 2015, we introduced the first 10 varieties on the market. We are going to discuss these varieties later on. And last year, we registered 4 more varieties of Pinot resistant types to the market. In 2015, Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo also launches its own breeding program aimed to obtain new-resistant wine and table grapes and also rootstock varieties and so-called improved autochthonous varieties we are going to discuss later. Next slide. Within our breeding program, we use different ways to create resistant varieties. So what is available now on the market? First of all, it's traditional breeding techniques. So it's generally the cross that we perform in the field or in the greenhouse. And later on, we perform phenotypic selection and molecular assessed selection. Most of all, in our breeding programs these days, we use the traditional breeding techniques, along with embryo rescue, for sure, for the selection and creation of seedless table grapes. But on the market, all across the world now, there is a growing attention to so-called new breeding techniques, especially to genome editing. Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo are also involved in several European projects for creation of genome-edited resistant grape varieties. The problem with genome-edited in Europe is that they are considered in Europe as genetically modified products, which is not strictly speaking true, and in other countries they are not considered being genetically modified products. So basically genome edited plants are the clones of traditional varieties the resistant clones of these varieties. But today we are going to discuss varieties that were created using the traditional breeding techniques, so crosses and selection. Next slide. As you can see on this slide, up to now, we have many different genes of resistance available. With using these genes, we can perform the marker-assisted selection. So we perform some selections in the lab. We send material and can say that our varieties, new varieties, contains these and these different genes of resistance. Mainly, our breeding is focused on powdery and downy mildew, and most of the genes available now for these two diseases. But for sure, there is a growing attention to other diseases like black rot, anthracnose, and phomopsis, for example. And we do incorporate these genes to our breeding activity as well. The next slide is about the objectives of our breeding activities. First of all, for when we are talking about the wine varieties, here on the right, you can see the picture of Glera genotype. Glera variety is used for production of famous Prosecco wines. And here on the right, you can see actually the new resistant genotypes very close to its organoleptic properties and to its morphological properties, also to the original Glera variety. So when we are talking about our selection process, to us is very important to select variety that has aromatic and polyphenolic profile of comparable, typical, or superior quality to the noble variety. So, for example, if we are taking Glera, our aim would be to create 2 or 3 resistant analogues of Glera that have different genes of resistance inside, but are very, very similar to Glera, not only ampelographically, but also in terms of agronomic properties and enological properties. Later on, when we are going to discuss our new varieties that are available already on the market, I will show the whole process of selection that we use. So when we are selected these new resistant varieties, we are focused not only on the resistant, but for sure on the first place for us is quality. But we have to consider the resistance itself. We are going to select the durable, the genotypes that have durable resistance. So for us, it's very important. We are focused mainly on downy and powdery mildew, but not only. We would like to select varieties that are tolerant to botrytis, to secondary diseases. They are tolerant or resistant in case they have any resistance genes to these diseases. By secondary diseases, I mean black rot, phomopsis, and anthracnose for sure. And are tolerant to some abiotic stress and Drosophila Suzuki, for example, pests, because we do have some problems with that. In some cases, we have problems with phylloxera on the leaves, so we try to select genotypes that are more resistant to these pests as well. On the next slide, we can see the objectives for our table grape breeding programs. Apart from the resistance breeding itself, so we also would like to have genotypes that are resistant to downy powdery mildew and different pests and secondary diseases. We would like to have genotypes that are of particular aromatic and polyphenolic profile, superior to the most popular varieties on the market now, table varieties, that have good agronomic characteristics for sure, big cluster in berry, last cluster, crunchy pulp, and resistance to cracking for sure. If we are talking about the table grapes, we do have, as I already mentioned, resistance to seedlessness for table grapes, but not only. And we do select for the smaller parts of our table grape breeding is focused on also some exotic flavors in our table grapes. And the next slide is focused on the objectives for the rootstock breedings. here on the right, you can see the pictures of the 4 rootstocks already available from VCR that were bred by the Milano State University. I will not discuss them today because we are more focused on wine grape breeding today in our today's presentations, but nonetheless, this information is available. And our breeding activities are also focused on rootstock breedings. The problem with rootstock breeding is that they are really long. Yes, if we are talking about rootstock breedings, we are talking about like 15 to 20 years at least. But we are very happy to have a lot of collaborators and a lot of good starting material for rootstock breeding. So we are focused for sure on phylloxera-resistant nematodes, resistant anthracnose and agrobacterium resistance, but also tolerance to some abiotics conditions like high calcium content in the soil, salinity, drought resistance, humidity, poor soils and nutrients, and viruses. And up to now, we already have like 500 different rather good and resistant to phylloxera genotypes in the field. We test them now for the resistance to different viruses, and the next stage would be to graft them with some international varieties to see the grafting ability and the quality performance of these international varieties. On the next slide, you can see actually the breeding activities we performed in terms of wine grape breeding. We performed up to now from 2015 to this year to 2021. And with all the range of different varieties, you can see here that we work not only with international varieties such as Chardonnay, Syrah, Merlot, and Cabernet Sauvignon, etc., but also some autochthonous varieties like Glera, for example, I already mentioned, autochthonous Italian varieties, autochthonous French varieties, autochthonous Spanish varieties, but also some autochthonous varieties from, for example, Caucasus, Saperavi and Crozzetelli. Why do we work with these varieties? Not only because we work in the countries they are grown into, but also because we see the perspective of these varieties from the climate change. Yes, they have a high plasticity, these varieties, in terms of adaptation to different pedoclimatic conditions. And we see the growing demand in such varieties all across Europe now, but we see also that these varieties might be of high interest all over the world in the future. So we work with these varieties as well. And on the next slide, you can see several pictures showing how do we work. So we do perform crosses in the greenhouse, but not only in the vineyard itself. Here you can see, for example, our team of, we do call them in Italian, castratrici di Rauscedo, because they do perform, they are predominantly women, and they do perform the emasculation of the plants, as women are more precise in that. So as I told you, we perform some crosses in the greenhouse, and we collect the berries and the seeds, and we sow the seeds in the greenhouse. And on the left, you can see the picture of our greenhouse, where we do perform the first inoculation with Plasmopara reticula, downy mildew, or Unsnula nicata oidium. And this is how we perform the first screening for the genotypes that are resistant to these diseases. For sure, the resistant genotypes, then we put them outside in the field conditions. And we are going to discuss this later, why it is so important always to check the resistance in the field and not rely only the data that we have in the lab. And the genotypes that are showing high resistance response are checked for with the marker-assisted selections for the presence of several genes of resistance for each disease in this case. So this is the overview of our breeding activities in VCR, and the next part of our presentation, the next slide, about the resistant varieties bred by University of Udine in collaboration with Institute for Applied Genomics and Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo. All these varieties are now available in the market, and first of these varieties are actually available in Brazil now. So on the next slide, you can see that the first 10 varieties were registered in the national catalog in Italy in 2015. Plantar and Sorelli are based on the cross with Tokai Friulano variety, which is a autochthonous French and Italian variety. The 3 Sauvignons, based on the cross with Sauvignon Blanc. Then we have 2 Merlot varieties like Merlot Cantus and Merlot Coros, which are based on the Merlot crosses, and Cabernet Eidos and Cabernet Bolus are based on the Cabernet Sauvignon crosses. And Julius is based on Regent cross, also in new resistant varieties. So these 10 varieties are now available almost in most of the countries, not only in Europe, but outside Europe as well. If we're talking about Brazil, the 8 varieties from this list are available in Brazil. So all of these varieties except for Sauvignon Nepis and Julius. And recently, last year, we registered 4 new varieties based on the crosses with Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir. So also with these crosses, we used some more prominent and more resistant donors of resistance. So they are of even higher resistance to the downy and powdery mildew. If we are looking on the next slide, we can see the registration status of these varieties. As I already mentioned, these varieties are registered in different countries, and in many other countries, they are under registration process. On the next slide, you can see the protection status of these varieties. So most of them are already patented or protected in Europe and United States of America and Canada. And also in Brazil, the 8 varieties I was talking about, they are not only registered, but they are protected in Brazil. And in process of registration, we have 6 varieties in South Africa now and in Chile as well. On the next slide, we can see that the soil and climate characteristics of the evaluation sites. So as I told you earlier, it is very important to check the resistance response, not as well as the quality response for sure of these varieties, not only in the lab or in one pedoclimatic conditions, but all over Europe or across the world if we are going outside Europe now. So what we do every year, we have a lot of different collaborations with different research institutes all across the world, and we collect all the data every year. Once a year, we have wine tastings of these varieties with the presentations of their performance in terms of resistance and in terms of quality in all these different pedoclimatic conditions. On the next slide, you can see the origin of resistance donors that we use to create these varieties. It is quite complex crosses performed already for creation of the donors. Most of our donors we used recently have at least 5 genes of resistance in one donor. So 3 genes, for example, for downy mildew, and 2 to 3 genes to powdery mildew as well. And these donors are not, you know, there's some wild species. They were actually backcrossed up to 8 to 9 times to Vitis vinifera. So in this case, they already have a high percentage of Vitis vinifera genome inside and a lot of high quality characteristics. So when we are selecting the donors in order to perform the cross with noble variety, we already look for donors of high quality and high resistance. So the next step will be to perform the cross with a noble variety like Merlot or Pinot or Sauvignon, and then to select the variety that is really close in terms of organoleptic qualities to the noble variety. On the next slide, we can see the range of our white varieties with the indication of the cross on the top and their agronomic characteristics. All these varieties, as I told you, will be or are already available on Brazil market, except for Sauvignon Nepis from this list. And the 2 Pinot varieties are under registration now. Most of them are really close to their parent varieties, in this case Tokai Friulano or Sauvignon or Pinot Blanc, in terms of agronomic characteristics. Plus, they do possess the resistance to downy or powdery mildew. And also, in some cases, they are of really high winter hardiness due to the introductions of some Vitis amurensis crosses inside. Progeny that are, actually Vitis amurensis is coming from China, where the conditions are really tough for the low temperatures in winter. So in plus, these varieties are adapted to cooler climate, not only to the climate of the south, but also to the climate, Nordic climate. And on the next slide, we can see the red varieties available now, the 2 Merlots, 2 Cabernet Sauvignons, and 2 Pinot Noir type of varieties like Pinot Corse and Baltournis that are under registration status now. As you can see, they are of high resistance to downy and powdery mildew as well. Just to give you an idea of how we perform the selection process in terms of our new varieties, we can have a look at the next slide, and I will tell you 2 new varieties that we have. One white is Pinot Iskra, for example, varieties, which is actually the cross of this new, of very high quality and very resistant Dawn of Resistance, which is under the number name SK0017 with Pinot Blanc. So, as I told you, our aim in creation of these varieties is not only the excellent resistance. For example, if we are talking of Pinot Iskra, we can see that it already has 2 genes of resistance to downy mildew and 2 genes, very good genes of resistance to powdery mildew. So, and it also have a good tolerance to black rot. So it's really resistant, but also very close in terms of its characteristics to Pinot Blanc varieties. And for example, on this slide, you can see the data, agronomical data of this variety for the 2020 wines, which we tasted in June this year, and compared the wines from different locations. Most of them for sure are in Italy, because this is a new variety and it was introduced onto the market only in 2020, but also from other countries as well. So you can see that we compare for different characteristics like yield and sugar content, total acidity, pH. And on the next slide, you can see also the characteristics of these varieties in terms of wine quality. For sure, on the next slide, you can see that we send these varieties also, even though they are very new and they are resistant varieties, we send them already to different competitions, wine competitions already. For example, this variety was sent to PV International Wine Award. This competition is focused especially on resistant varieties, and we can see that it had like 85 points out of 100, which is very good result, because in Vivai Cooperativi Rauscedo, when we perform winemaking, we are talking not about the traditional volumes we are talking in industry, but it's a micro vinification. So when we micro vinificate the wine, we are talking about 200 liters per each sample. And when we win such high points in different competitions with our micro samples, this is really good, because it gives us an idea that when we perform, or our customers, the winemakers, will perform the vinification on the industrial scale, they will have even higher results, better results. And on the next slide, you can see the comparison of these wines from 2020 that we have performed using a huge panel of different specialists in the area. So during these wine tastings that we have of our microvinifications, we collect the samples from different sites. We compare them for sure with a referent variety or control variety. In our case, it's Pinot Blanc, because we would like to select a variety which is really close in terms of quality to Pinot Blanc, or even superior to the quality. And when we are talking about the panelists, these are the people that work in industry. So these are our technicians for sure, coming from Rauscedo, but also these are our wine growers, winemakers from Italy, but also all across the world, our collaborators from research institutes for sure, wine journalists, sommelier, enologists. So as you can see, there is a huge range of panelists working in the industry that give us the feedback on these varieties. So in this case, we can really know if we should proceed or not to proceed with the varieties. And on the next slide, you can see the sensory evaluation performed of this variety many times already. Our aim is to select variety which is really close to the noble variety, and the red line represents Pinot Blanc. And you can see that all the samples are somewhat close to this variety from the sensory organoleptic point of view. On the next slide, you can see that we do perform analysis also of different aromatic compounds in our wine and compare them to Pinot Blanc. And by this, we also can confirm the strong resemblance of the new varieties to the noble parent, in this case Pinot Blanc, but also precise the use of these varieties from an enological point of view, based on the point of view of our panelists, but also on our knowledge coming from the requests that are needed from aromatic, for example, point of view. And if we're talking about Pinot Iskra variety, we can see that this variety will perform really well from its fresh acidity and its structure, but also from its aromatic profile in sparkling wine production. And in fact, we performed sparkling vinification this year, and our collaborators in Champagne region in France also performed the sparkling wine production this year. So we are really eager to see the final results in order to communicate them later on to our customers, wine growers. And on the next slide, you can see another variety, Pinot Corse, which is based on the cross with Pinot Noir variety. You can see that it's really of high resistance to downy and powdery mildew for sure, and a good tolerance to black rot. It has several genes of resistance to downy mildew and one very strong gene of resistance to powdery mildew. You can see also that we performed the same type of evaluation in 2020 as for every variety that we have. We collected the wine samples from different areas, not only in Italy, but also from France, for example, from Czech Republic this year. And on the next slide, you can see the wine characteristics of this variety on the next slide. Yes, exactly. And you can also see that we sent the sample of this variety of Pinot Corse to the International PV Wine Award and Pcr Wine Award this year, and it won 94 points out of 100, which is really great, we think, for this variety, which says that it is really appreciated by the wine growers and our consumers as a Pinot Noir type of variety. And on the next slide, you can see the comparison of the wines that we collected in 2020 with the Pinot Noir variety. And you can see that most of the wines even exceed in their quality the Pinot Noir variety, especially the sample that we have from France, which is good because from France we have a huge request on Pinot types of varieties. And on the next slide you can see the sensory profile of Pinot coarse variety, with some samples quite close to the sensory profile of Pinot Noir variety, but in some cases we saw that, especially in the northern Italy, we saw that it resembles much, it has a higher value of mature fruits in it and sweet flowers and floral notes when compared to pure Pinot Noir variety. On the next slide you can see that we performed, in terms of Pinot Iskra variety, we performed also the analysis of aromatic profile and found out that it is really close to Pinot Noir, but still we see that some aromatic compounds prevail in Pinot coarse. And also when compared to Pinot Noir, we can notice that it has higher content of anthocyanins and polyphenols when compared to the parent varieties, which is due to the climate change that we can observe nowadays, considered to be even a good sign for the Pinot types of varieties, and it is really appreciated from our customers, wine growers, from this point of view. And on the next slide, I would like to show you that we also compare for example, the anthocyanin profile of these varieties. Why is it so important? Most of the resistant varieties available on the market were selected like 30-40 years ago, and they are quite far away in terms of quality from the Vitis vinifera variety. And as our objective is to select variety which is really close in terms of quality to the noble variety Vitis vinifera, we have to consider different aspects, and anthocyanin profile is one of them. As we saw that most of the old varieties are really far away from the Vitis vinifera varieties, it can cause some problems in terms of vinification in the future, whereas the varieties that we select, and in this case we are talking about the Pinot Noir type of varieties such as Pinot Corse and Valtournis, two new varieties, they are very close, not only to Pinot Noir, but also to Vitis vinifera red varieties profile in general. And when we are talking about the special substances that we can find existent all resistant varieties, I couldn't not to mention the substance, for example, indicated on the next slide, such as methyl alcohol or methanol. In Europe, the legislation is quite strict. So we have to check all our varieties and for the presence of this substance, for the presence of methanol in this case, and it's much lower when compared to the maximum accepted level. Moreover, it is comparable to the Vitis vinifera varieties, as in terms of white varieties, as we can see on this slide, and in terms of red varieties, as we can see on the next slide. When we are talking about older varieties, I couldn't not mention some substances, such as, for example, methanol or malvidin-diglucazide, or, for example, methylanthranilate. In European legislation, which is rather strict, we have to avoid these substances in our new varieties. So for sure, all our varieties are checked for the presence of these substances. In terms of malvidin-diglucazide, I would say that there is nothing wrong with this substance, but according to older legislation, it is used as a marker of hybrid grapes. But in the new generations of resistant varieties, it is usually absent. The problem with this variety is that it is present also in Vitis vinifera varieties, such as Sangiovese, for example. Autochthonous Italian varieties, very famous from Toscana region. It is also present, but it's not hybrid, it's Vitis vinifera. Nonetheless, we have to check our varieties for this substance. And if we're talking about methylenthranilate or furaniol, we also check our varieties, because these substances, aromatic substances, are coming mostly from Vitis labrusca, for example, and are responsible for foxy flavors or lighter strawberry notes in the wines that are not accepted from the European point of view, but are accepted on other markets. So, but nonetheless, as we would like our varieties to be as close to the aromatic profile to the Vitis vinifera varieties, we try to avoid these substances in our varieties. On the next slide, we can move to the third and last part of our presentation, which is a protection strategy of the resistant varieties. This is the last part of my presentation, but is a very crucial part in growing and adapting resistant varieties. At first, there was some confusion coming probably from the breeders, but also from scientific societies with regards to resistant varieties, or lack of knowledge and research, that if the variety is resistant to a certain disease, we shall not spray this variety. This concept is very old and 100% wrong. So if we're talking about resistant varieties, we still have to spray them, we still have to protect them from the diseases, and how we can do it and why we should do it, I will explain in this part of my presentation. So on the right, you can see the concept of resistance. Yes, when we are talking of the breeding programs now, on the next slide, you can see that most of the breeding programs now are working with so-called gene-to-gene resistance or race-specific. So earlier in my presentation, you see different genes of resistance we can test, we work with, and we can test for the presence of these genes in our material, which is quite good. And easy to work with. The resistance is really strong, but it is also easier for the pathogen to overcome this resistance. And we have to keep this in mind. That is why, although we work with so-called race-specific resistance, we also should keep in mind, especially in our breeding programs, in VCR, we do keep in mind so-called quantitative resistance. That works with minor genes that are not yet so known. We cannot test them in the lab, or we cannot perform the molecular markers because they are not known for the presence of these small minor genes of resistance, but we can test them in the field and see that if the variety performs really great in terms of resistance in the field, it might have this new smaller resistance genes as well. If we are talking about gene-to-gene resistance, on the next slide, you can see how actually it works. The pathogen versus the plant interaction. It is rather complex interaction, and our knowledge is quite limited. We do know a lot up to now, but nonetheless, it is quite limited. How does it work? In simple word, it works like the key and the lock. So the pathogen attacks the plant. The plant, if it's resistant and if it has the certain resistant genes, recognizes the pathogen and starts the immune response to this pathogen. This is how the gene-to-gene resistance works. The problem is, if in the field you have a new strain of the pathogen, it can easily overcome this resistance if you have only one resistance mechanism involved, or one resistant gene that is responsible for the certain mechanisms of the resistance. That is why it is so important to combine different genes of resistance in one plant. In this way, to the pathogen, it's much harder to overcome this resistance, because he can overcome one mechanism, but still there is a second gene involved and it is still there. For sure, even the two genes of resistance in the future, it is possible that they might be overcome by the pathogen, and it's naturally so, because this is evolution and nothing immune, unfortunately, in our world. That is what we can see also with the current situation. But still, as a breeder, we are focused for the durability, and we will try to protect. And to protect this resistance, there are different ways, one of which is combine different genes of resistance. The second way would be to spray and help a little bit a plant to retain resistance, spray against pathogen. And on the next slide, you can see that the interaction between the plant and the pathogen is not as straightforward. There is a third factor involved, which is environment. And the research about the environment and interaction with the pathogen and the plant, there is not much research for certain pathogens, like most predominant pathogens. If we are talking about viticulture, it's Plasmopora viticola or downy mildew and powdery mildew. And we found very few recent studies. There are more and more now, but up until now, there were very few studies that studied the interaction between environment versus pathogen versus the plant. And as you can see on that slide, the recent study in Italy, for example, they discovered that for downy mildew, they discovered 106 different strains, which is quite huge, with different level of virulence. And the viability of this strain depended a lot on the environment. So what does it mean to us as a breeder, and what does it mean to us as a wine grower? When we select a resistant variety, we cannot just take this variety selected from one side and say, okay, it was good in North Italy and we are sure it will be good in our place. No, it's not always so. That is why it is very important for us as a breeder to perform the evaluations on the site in different countries, in different regions at least, in order to be able to consult, to advise our customers, the wine growers, what they should choose. And even in Italy, we can see a huge range of variation in terms of resistance response and for sure quality response of our resistant varieties. And it is very good that Italy has different zones and in terms of pedoclimatic conditions and different interaction of resistance, pathogen, environment, and also the quality aspect. So we always should keep this in mind. On the next slide, you can see a little bit, I will not focus so much attention because it's mostly just to give you the idea how complex the subject is to create this variety, to select them and to adapt, and what considerations we should have in mind when operating with these varieties. As a breeder, we can have a look at some other crops like barley or wheat, and we can see that all the big genes have already been discovered. So what next? What when these old genes will be overcome? What shall we do? And the answer is we have to still spray our varieties. We still have to protect them. And on the next slide, you can see that there is a lot what we can learn actually from the fungicide strategies. There is a parallel we can make from the fungicide resistance to the pathogen resistance interaction with the plant. There are a lot of parallels and we really should learn from that and take this into consideration. The problem is we have to be honest with ourselves. The pathogen will win the battle in the end. But still, there is a lot of stuff that we can do. So on the next slide, you can see what are the breeder's recommendations when we are talking about the resistance variety. We need durability. And in order to achieve that, we need to combine, when you are buying the resistant varieties, you need to be sure the resistance response is good in your area, and the more genes of resistance for one pathogen you have in your variety, the more resistant it will be. In more environment your variety was tested already, the better resistance it will have, or at least the better recommendations and advices you can have already, or parallels you can have to select a variety that is right for your particular area. Annual fungicide application is very crucial for the resistant varieties. For sure, we will spray them at much lower scale when compared to the classical traditional varieties, but still they are crucial. The disease management in nearby blocks is crucial as well, because if you grow non-resistant varieties around the resistant varieties, they should be duly sprayed as well in order to lower the inoculum of the pathogen. And even if your varieties that you are buying, resistant varieties, have only one gene of resistance, it's okay. Just keep in mind that it would be better to combine in your vineyard varieties that have different genes of resistance to the wine pathogen. On the next slide, you can see our recommendations as VCR that we give to the wine growers. We created a whole brochure that is available on our website, how to actually treat these varieties in the field. So first of all, the choice of varieties. I already mentioned a lot of criteria how to choose these varieties. So just to sum up all of these criteria, for sure you have to focus on the final product that you want to have from the quality point of view, but also collect the information available for the level of resistance to certain pathogens. Have a look what level of resistance do your normal varieties, or what problems do you normally have in your vineyard. In this case, you can adapt the new varieties for the protection strategy you already use, and choose the varieties that are more resistant to more problematic pathogens in your particular vineyards. On the next slide is mentioned the agronomic management. For sure, when we are talking about resistant varieties, we should have the same approach we have with the traditional varieties from the agronomic point of view. So I won't spend too much time on that. You already know what to do in terms of pathogen protection of normal varieties, in terms of agronomic management of your plants. So the same is applicable to the resistant varieties. Moreover, I will mention that most of the resistant varieties are more vigorous when compared to traditional varieties. So we have to keep this in mind. And on the next slide, our recommendations for the phytosanitary management. To sum up, what I already told, we need to keep in mind the situation that you have in your field. Yes, the historical data that you have, number of sprays, what the pathogens look like what is the most predominant pathogen, what problems do you already have, in order to be able to choose the right variety which is right for you. You do need to perform the sprays with these varieties in order to reduce the inoculum of pathogens. Why do we need to do this? In order to avoid the incidence of pathogens, really virulent pathogens that can overcome the resistance of the plants. That's what I was talking about earlier. We have to help the plant to retain resistance. So several sprays during the living cycle of the annual cycle of the plant is really necessary. And last but not least, it's to avoid the occurrence of secondary diseases, such as bladder, phomopsis, anthracnose, and some others. With our normal traditional varieties, when we perform the normal protection strategy, we can see, we almost don't see these secondary diseases because they are protected with the normal sprays against peronospora, against downy and powdery mildew. But when we're talking about resistant varieties, we significantly reduce the number of sprays up to 80% Yes, and in this case, if you have a high pressure of secondary diseases, for sure they can occur in your vineyard, because most of the resistant varieties available on the market nowadays are not resistant to the secondary disease. They are resistant to powdery and downy mildew, but they could be tolerant to black rot or botrytis, but not resistant in a pure sense. So you have to keep this in mind as well. And as the treatments, since they are fewer in number, they must be positioned at the moment of maximum infection pressure in your vineyard. And for sure, to know the maximum infection pressure, in our vineyard, we use some monitoring devices, constant monitoring and forecasting models. You can have a look at the weather forecasts and leaf wetness, for example. Monitor the primary infection. There are also some normal advices, like common advices, like you have to use the maximum label dose of the fungicides, in this case, suitable volumes of water, right active ingredients, and you should consider the vineyard history. So this is predominant, really. Just a very short overview of the example of protection strategy that we used in Italy, just to give you an idea. The next slide, you can see the protection strategy that we used in Grado, Fossalon di Grado. This is a block site where we have a lot of our new experimental varieties. Here we collected the 4 years data. On the left, you can see the precipitation rate in different years during the season. And we compared the conventional, traditional varieties and resistant varieties on the right. So you can see in the end, in different years, we have like reduced the number of sprays to 83 and 82%, up to 67 when we are talking about powdery mildew resistance. So on average, in our vineyard site, we can reduce to 70 up to 75% on average the use of pesticides when compared to the traditional varieties. And on the next slide, you can see the example, more detailed example of protection strategy we used in the same site, but in 2020 with the precipitation rate, and what products we used for downy mildew and powdery mildew, and against some secondary diseases such as phomopsis or black rot in this case. Some of the substances are actually has a double action against traditional diseases such as downy and powdery mildew and the secondary diseases such as black rot and phomopsis. For sure, if you want to reduce the number of sprays, it is always better to combine, to use the phytosanitary products that have a dual action against different diseases. As you can see from this slide, we performed 2 treatments against downy mildew, 5 treatments against powdery mildew, and when compared to certain treatments we performed for the traditional varieties. 2020 was really particular year. As you can see, we had really high precipitation rate, especially in June, which is not common for our area. But using this protection strategy, we didn't see any production loss with our resistant varieties. And on the next slide, you can have a look at the another example of protection strategy that we used on another experimental site, actually in Rauscedo, where our office is actually situated. And over there, we have to use 4 treatments against downy mildew with 5 treatments against powdery mildew, well compared to 16 treatments in total with traditional varieties. So, and no production loss. Actually, you can see that for black rot, we had to perform 2 treatments because the pressure with the black rots on this site is higher. Given all this that we discussed in this presentation, what is the message to take home? When you are thinking about how to protect the resistant varieties, you need to rely on the history of your vineyard, on historical average of the treatments performed on the vineyard, and consider that the use of the new resistant varieties will allow you a reduction between 60 to 80% depending on pedoclimatic conditions each season. Because for sure, if one season you have higher precipitation rate or higher pressure from the pathogen due to different pedoclimatic, climatic conditions, you can reduce to 60%, but the next year is much better, and then you can reduce up to 80%. So we cannot tell you you have to spray 2 times and you are okay. No, you have to spray based on the percentage of what we spray usually on the vineyard. And we have to spray right from the beginning, from the first year of plantations, even though you don't have any yield yet, because in order to protect the varieties from the emergence of the virulent pathogens. What are the benefits of using these varieties? On the next slide, you can see, actually, this is a slide with the message to take home. And on the next slide, you can see the benefits. We performed a project in collaboration with Horto University. On the next slide, yes, this slide, under the Innovine, European project Innovine, where we used our varieties, we compared them to the traditional varieties, and we observed that the use of resistant varieties can help us significantly reduce the economic costs, energy consumption, water consumption, impact on biodiversity, and toxicological risks. You can see the numbers here. Here is the example of Merlot Cantus, for example, variety in different regions of Italy on the north, where there is a higher rate of precipitation and higher pressure from the pathogens, and on the south, where there is not much, there are not much pathogen pressure. So the impact is a little bit lower. And on the next slide, actually, the benefits in terms of costs calculated for the wine grower. We did this in Italy. Depending on the region we are talking about, like northern Italy, central and southern Italy, you can see the reduction of costs per hectare per year. Yes, for example, for the northern Italy, where the pedoclimatic conditions are much more favorable for the development of the pathogens, by the reduction up to 60 to 80% of the application of phytosanitary products, we see the reduced total costs per hectare up to 1,000 euros. Yes, for sure, going to the south, the reduction will be lower because there is not much pathogen pressure over there. But still, 1,000 euro per hectare per year is really a good number. So if we calculate the average life cycle of the modern vineyard is about 30 years, we can calculate that we will reduce the cost for 32,000 euros per hectare in the life cycle of the vineyard, which is rather good, I think. And as a result, we will have a healthier vineyard and healthier wines. So thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and please do not hesitate to ask me questions if you have any. All the material to the resistant varieties are available on our website, as well as the protection strategy of the resistant varieties. So you can have a look over there, or you can have my contact from the organizers and contact me directly if you will have any questions. Thank you.
Eu quero agradecer a doutora Eisia, porque eu fiquei bem impressionada assim, com a qualidade da apresentação, toda a parte que ela abordou, a abordagem ela fez em vários nichos, e assim a gente ficou super satisfeito. Então a gente está muito feliz e grato por essa dedicação e atenção que ela deu pra gente aqui no evento. Pessoal, bom, pessoal, essa palestra, ela excedeu, porque assim, na verdade, eu fiquei bem satisfeita e até quero agradecer publicamente, né, a Rauscedo, o Charles, que vai falar com a gente agora, e a doutora Eisia, porque eu acho que assim, ela trouxe bastante, exatamente, né, ela trouxe uma visão global daquilo, acho que ela foi muito didática, e isso foi bem importante pra gente, porque era bem a proposta mesmo, era isso que a gente queria, e depois cada um que tem interesse específico vai procurar o que precisa, o que quer de informação, né? Só que a gente tem um tempo curto para fazer, né? Inclusive, a gente está atrasado já na nossa programação, mas a gente tem um tempo curto para fazer aqui, né? Então, não tinha como abrir muito. E aí, eu pedi, então, procure, como é um assunto mais específico, né? Eu pedi para o Curi acompanhar essa gravação junto com a gente, então ele acompanhou tudo que eu estava em estúdio, ele estava lá em Bento e a doutora Eisia estava na Itália no dia. E aí eu pedi para ele, então, me dar um suporte para ele fazer essas perguntas para ela, perguntas que a gente sabe que surgiriam, né? Como a gente não tinha esse ao vivo com ela. Então, o Curi fez essas perguntas, só que assim, gente, uma palestra que era para ter 1 hora, tem 1h40. Então, a gente dividiu em 2 etapas. Aqui vocês viram a apresentação original dela, e agora já vai estar disponível para vocês assistirem a parte do Curi com ela. E aí, depois, a gente vai chamar agora o Charles, que ele é aqui do Brasil, lá do Rio Grande do Sul, ele é representante da Rauscedo, e ele vai conversar um pouquinho com vocês também sobre a Rauscedo e a parte, né, mais comercial aqui do país, né, como acessar tudo isso que ela falou. E, em seguida, vocês podem assistir também toda essa tira dúvida, que, na verdade, foi mais legal do que a palestra, inclusive porque os dois começaram ali a conversar, e vários assuntos surgiram. Então, em seguida, vocês vão poder assistir isso depois de acessar de casa, e ela deixou aqui, ela foi super legal, super acessível, ela deixou aqui para quem quiser conversar com ela pessoalmente, tiver alguma outra dúvida, pode pedir para a gente os contatos, que a gente passa o contato dela, tá certo? Então, é isso. Então, agora eu vou chamar o Charles Pontalti. Oi, Charles.
Boa noite.
Boa noite, tudo bem?
Bem, queria agradecer a oportunidade que a gente tem esse vínculo com pessoas que a gente não conhece e consegue organizar um evento, né, desse tamanho, que eu estou impressionado com o número de pessoas, a organização, enfim, agradecer a oportunidade.
O Charles foi o grande viabilizador, né, para a gente conseguir esse acesso, essa conversa com a doutora Eisia. E então eu quero te agradecer, né, Charles, porque a gente também não se conhecia. Tem que olhar aí, né? A gente também não se conhecia. E o Charles, ele já, logo de cara, ele topou, ele falou, não, peraí que eu vou colocar vocês em contato. Então agora o Charles vai falar um pouquinho para vocês sobre a parte aqui do Brasil da Rauscedo, como acessar tudo isso que já foi dito na última palestra. Então, Charles, está com você, tá?
Mais uma vez, então, obrigado. Eu só queria fazer alguns comentários. Por exemplo, eu tive a oportunidade de já há alguns anos trabalhar com essa empresa, e eu normalmente não faço venda, a não ser que a pessoa me chame. O que a gente procura fazer é pós-venda, porque existe, assim, uma teoria, ou vamos dizer, uma expectativa de que as plantas importadas são melhores. Eu não quero falar na questão genética, eu quero dizer que são plantas que normalmente ficam em câmara fria, passam por um processo de transporte via marítima, enfrentar burocracia, porto, tirar análise, etc. Então, claro que, eventualmente, a gente tem alguns problemas. Mas a empresa sempre foi muito receptiva. Nós tivemos casos, assim, de problemas que foram resolvidos, e temos também muitas pessoas que estão muito felizes, muito contentes. e principalmente porque essa empresa ela consegue introduzir material. Se você precisar de uma variedade da Geórgia, de Portugal, da Espanha, da Grécia, da França, da Itália, da Espanha, sei lá eles têm esse tipo de possibilidade de trazer esse material. E o que eu gostaria também de comentar é, como a gente viu na palestra da Ásia, que é a minha colega, né, nós estamos oficialmente ou extraoficialmente com vários institutos de pesquisa, inclusive aí em Jundiaí. Para o ano que vem já tem um contrato assinado para trazer esse material para fazer uma avaliação em loco, né? Então, nós para citar a Embrapa aqui de Bento, que foi a primeira que recebeu o material, a IPAGRE em Santa Catarina, temos a Unicamp agora em Jundiaí, que é para o ano que vem, temos a IPAMIG em Andradas, lá também tem um experimento que foi instalado este ano, temos a Unipampa, que fica aqui na nossa fronteira, e temos também um professor da URGS, também tem essas plantas já em campo. Temos também algumas empresas que plantaram uma quantidade um pouco maior, estão tendo um pouco de problema com botrites. Me parece que a utilização de fungicidas para mildio e ídio acabava também indiretamente ou diretamente contribuindo para que esse problema de podridão não fosse tão relevante como está sendo nessas variedades resistentes. Mas já temos, assim, 2 ou 3 agrônomos de uma linha mais ecológica, ou pelo menos assim, que fazem algum tipo de tratamento, que eu prefiro não entrar no mérito, porque essas coisas, o ideal é que a pesquisa faça o seu trabalho e que oriente os agricultores, que estão conseguindo produzir essas variedades, apesar desses problemas que algumas empresas que plantaram uma variedade um pouco maior enfrentaram. Então, me parece que é só uma questão de achar a receita do bolo, né? E também me parece que essa questão das variedades resistentes é uma coisa meia eu não vou dizer inevitável, mas como houve outros avanços, as pessoas querem usar menos veneno. Existe muito problema de deriva, você tem lá um vinhedo e o vizinho do lado compra uma área e tem uma criança. A criança não quer, o pai não quer que a criança seja submetida a tratamentos diários ou, sei lá, semanais. Enfim, é uma forma de se usar menos, de compactar menos o solo, etc. Então, me parece que é um caminho sem volta. Além disso, as variedades convencionais também a empresa traz. Então, outra coisa talvez interessante também, que eu estou sentindo agora, quando eu comecei a trabalhar com essa importação, 90% dos meus clientes eram do Rio Grande do Sul. E hoje está havendo uma expansão. Eu estive, por exemplo, no início da viticultura em São Joaquim. E fui lá numa festa da maçã, o pessoal tomando cerveja e comendo peixe, porque a 50 quilômetros daí estava o mar. Eu achava que ia tomar vinho e comer carne. E isso, aquela região lá já se tornou um polo turístico, enoturístico, o que levou as pessoas para lá, além do frio e da maçã, foi o apelo que as pessoas que gostam de tomar vinho sentem de conhecer esse tipo de proposta diferente que é os vinhos de altitude. Então, aí, agora está bem forte, me parece, várias empresas. As empresas me pedem, a gente tem um pouco de dificuldade de usar o nome, porque algumas gostam de sigilo, então eu prefiro não dizer o nome de ninguém, mas aí na Serra da Mantiqueira, essa questão do pessoal que está usando essa dupla poda, ou de inverno, que seja, E hoje está em clientes em Pernambuco, em Alagoas, na Bahia, São Paulo, Paraná, Mato Grosso, e me parece que é um jeito que a gente tem, produzindo no local, de vencer um pouco a resistência das pessoas em consumir um vinho nacional. Essencialmente, o que eu gostaria de transmitir é isso. Mais uma vez, eu agradeço a oportunidade. Se precisarem de qualquer coisa, podem pedir o meu e-mail, meu telefone com a organização, e eu, com certeza, esse ano que eu falo agora, 2021, nós entregamos uma quantidade relativamente grande de plantas, e eu pretendo visitar esses agricultores, esses viticultores. Então eu pretendo fazer essas visitas, e com certeza eu pretendo ir aí em Jundiaí também para conhecer as pessoas aí que me convidaram para esse evento. Agradeço, e se quiserem alguma pergunta, enfim, estou às ordens para a organização.
Oi, Charles. Eu te agradeço, e obviamente, quando você vier para cá, a gente faz questão de te receber, te levar aqui nos produtores da região, e eu vou deixar o seu contato aqui também para todos eles, né, para todo mundo que está aqui, para quem está assistindo. Depois a gente passa num e-mail que a gente tem que dispara para todos que fizeram a inscrição, a gente já passa todos os seus contatos também, tá certo?
Muito obrigado.
Obrigada até mais.
Tchau.
Ah, não, é o meu que tá com delay. PV. Tem certeza? Bom, pessoal,